podcast. This is Terry Lynn with LIVETRU. This is going to be one of my episodes, the second actually right now, in my water series podcast. So I'm going to be going into all things water. Right now I'm highlighting primary water, and I have with me two experts in that field, and I'm going to be introducing them, and we're going to be starting from there. So I have Larry Workham, and I believe he's from California. And I also have Mark Burr, who I think is also from California. Even though you might have residences in other states, you can just let us know. So I'd like you just to introduce yourself and let us know anything you'd like me to know in my audience about you and what you do perhaps presently now, and your short little bio of how you got interested and involved in specifically primary water. So Larry, I'm going to let you go first. So who are you and what do you do?
Larry Van Workham. I live in California. I was going to school back at San Luis Obispo, and I was graduating in 1997. And I guess in one of my geology classes, I heard about Stephen Reese. He lived down in Ojai, and back then there was no computers, but I knew he lived in Ojai, so I drove down to Ojai one day and found his address in the telephone book and drove up his driveway up on Sulphur Mountain and introduced myself. Okay. And we talked for a while. And
you made a wishful mistake. You said 1997. You're not that young, my friend.
Wait. No, 19, excuse me. 77, yes. 77. Anyway, I introduced myself to Steve, and we talked for a while. He gave me this book.
There it is.
Yep.
New Water for a Thirsty World, and he told me to read it. And he also gave me this book, The Divining Hand
by Christopher Bird.
And he told me to read them, and if I'm interested, come back and see him.
Okay, so, and you obviously did that.
Yeah, and so then we would talk maybe every 2 months, every 3 months, and he'd have something going on, and he'd call me up, and we'd go down to San Diego, or we'd go up to San Luis Obispo or Santa Barbara, and he'd show me the ropes. At one point, we got together with Morad, and we went up to San Luis Obispo and located a well up there. And at that point, Steve was talking to the Shah of Iran, and supposedly was putting something together that me and Morad were going to go over to Saudi Arabia and study this whole thing. Well, then everything went south in Iran, and that never happened. Morad had money, and he hung on with Stephen Reese, and Steve kind of helped him along, but there was no money in it, so I went on and pursued other careers.
So what was the initial interest for you? You said you had looked him up. Why? Why was that?
You know what? He was an entrepreneur. It was something interesting. It just caught my attention that something could do that. And ever since then, I thought, it's an amazing thing. Somebody's got to take the ball and run with it. And there was only Paul and one other guy that was doing it, Morad. And Morad really didn't do anything. And Paul is now passed on. And so I would search the internet once in a while, and lo and behold, I found Mark. And so thank goodness Mark took the ball and ran with it for future generations.
So let's move over to Mark Burr. So Mark Burr, you're also from California. You actually are the one you and Ryan surveyed my property for primary water about 2 years ago, I think now, almost 2 years ago, right around there. And so that's how I met you. And then we became acquainted later through one of the primary water groups. So tell us, the audience, a little bit about you, what got you interested in primary water and what you're doing now. And then we'll go into all kinds of specifics about all of that.
Sure. Kind of like Larry, you hear this about it for the first time, and it's intriguing, and you realize it's hugely impactful if it's real, if it's true, etc. And that was over a decade ago. And I heard about this from a gentleman living in Southern California whose daughter was going to school with Steve Reese's great grandniece. And he heard about it. And like, again, a lot of people said, this is incredible. He contacted me because I was doing some fundraising at the time for folks back through a connection into Wall Street. And those folks there told me, Mark, you travel the world. If you see anything in water, let us know. Water to them is the the next blue gold, right? So I told them about this story, and they said immediately, if it's in natural resources extraction, it's called the E&P model. I said, what's that? Exploration and production. That's how you raise money for a gold venture or an oil well or whatever. So I Googled water E&P, absolutely not a single hit on the whole internet. So it was kind of like, wow, there's this new category. And I searched and found some people, of course, doing groundwater exploration with satellites and a few actual teams doing it. But in a world where they said there was no water, it was surprising. And so anyway, I did my 6 months due diligence, read the books that Larry got, and I'm old California family, 5 generations back on both my parents' side, and it rang true, the politics of water being very vicious in that state. So I did my due diligence and decided, hey, let's go prove this. And that was over a decade ago, and I'm still in it.
Okay. So I thought, boy, so it hasn't been that long for you, really.
No.
Okay.
And really, as primary water technologies, when I realized one of the books is perfect segue. One of the books is very scientific, New Water for Thirsty World. The other one is Christopher Bird, well-known guy, by the way, for many different books and being an outside the box kind of thinking guy, was really on dowsing. And so when you get into the world of locating water wells, you cannot avoid the fact that most wells to this day are located by dowsers. But at the end of the day, I looked at that and said, well, every other extractive industry is using geophysics. Why aren't we for water? Yes, it's being used, but small number of cases where you have a big budget, commercial, industrial, municipal, not for you and me, right? It was very inaccessible outside of a few technologies that are, let's call it, drillers will tell you less than 1% of wells, they use that technology involved. I said, that doesn't sound right at all. So I went the technologies route and cobbled together a couple of technologies by 2017. So that's when I went all in for about only 6 or 7 years now. But Larry, you said you were in school still, or had you graduated?
I'm just graduating in 77.
And you went up to see Steve, and he was where? Up in Ojai?
Well, Steve lived in Ojai.
Okay.
It was a simple house. He didn't look like a businessman. He didn't act like a businessman. He was kind of a crotchety old guy. You had to do things his way.
German accent, right?
If you didn't do it his way, he didn't want anything to do with it. But old German guy.
So
when's the first time you met together with his team? Where were you? And was it 3-4 guys, or just you, him, and Morad, or?
No, the first time he picked me up, he lived in Ojai. I was done with school, and I was back in Pasadena, which is about an hour and a half drive. He came by, picked me up, and we drove down to San Diego. And we looked at Escondido. We looked at the Sparklets well. He had some customers that had avocados, and avocados need a lot more water once they mature. And he showed me some of the ropes and after reading the book, and showed me the hillsides and the geology and the structure of the hills and where fault lines might be. And we just started doing that. And we'd go out, like I said, maybe once every 6 months. With Morad, there was a guy that was writing a book, and 4 of us went up to San Luis Obispo, and I don't remember who that guy was, but Steve said, he goes, this is a textbook case. This one's very simple. We're going to go up there and look at it. So it was me, Morad, Stephen, and another guy that was going to write the book. Well, that well, once he drilled it, it collapsed. And there were some arguments going on that Steve failed, and the owner of the place was upset with it. And Stephen was like, the hell with it then. Goodbye, I'm leaving. But Morad went up and talked him into it and said, no, it collapsed, but there's water down there. And they drilled it. And then we were looking at Google Earth. Now that guy's got a big old pond, and he's got acres of grapes growing right there. When we were there was nothing, just dirt.
You bet. It's a beautiful ranch and winery and what do they call it? B&B, whatever, up there right now. So they struck gold, blue gold, in fact.
there was also a nonprofit, a charity thing that he was doing just in Goleta, up some canyon up there that he was working on. So he would show me different wells. He would tell me about different things. He told me about the California Aqueduct, that he went out long on his free time and located sites all along the California Aqueduct, so that at some day down in the future, we could drill wells right next to the California Aqueduct, like 20, 30 feet away, and simply use the aqueduct to bring water down to California. But because of politics and because the files are now in somebody else's hands, we don't have that information.
Did you see those maps?
No, I never saw them. I asked Morad for them, but they were up in his attic, and that's as far as it went.
Yeah, they're on the East Coast now. Did you ever be on drilling sites with him?
No. They were always had just drilled it, or we were looking at it, looking at where we wanted to drill it. Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
Also in Catalina Island, he drilled a well over there, and it collapsed, and the city got upset that it didn't work. So Steve gave up on it and left. But he claimed that it fed the golf course, because Catalina Island uses desalination water and water from a reservoir, but the golf course has wells, and the golf course waters every afternoon.
To this day, exactly.
To this day. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah. How about that?
Mm-hmm.
How about that?
So what we're doing, Larry, this is interesting because, and one of the reasons, among many that we wanted to have you on, you were referred to me by Mark, is because I don't know if you saw the first interview that I did with Davina Cox. She's Bill Cox's late wife, or wife, I should say. Bill Cox was trained by Vern Cameron.
And Vern was a neighbor, wasn't he?
For a period of time in Escondido, yes.
Yeah, this was in the 60s. So right around, it was the same period as Stephen Reese was around too. And from what I learned and understood from that video is there was kind of pockets of people that were doing the same thing, primary water. But like Davina didn't know Paul Powers. I think she met him once. But from my understanding, either Steve and Vern knew each other and were contemporaries, or Stephen actually trained Vern. I'm not clear on that. So
I think Stephen was Steve started with, he was a miner, or he worked in mines, and he wondered how come a mine flooded out when a mine is so deep in the ground. And that's where he thought something's going on. So I think he was the one that came up with the primary water theory.
So they were contemporaries. And Vern Cameron arrived in Southern California in the 1920s and watched his grandmother witch their homestead well. And he was obsessed with it for the rest of his life. Said, I am going to figure out the science behind it. How did she learn about it? From Indians in Minnesota. So they come down there, and he dedicates his life, and we're talking 1930s, 40s. In World War II, they're going to him and asking him maybe to train a military to look for spider holes in, the Pacific and things. Mm-hmm. So he was a fascinating guy with dowsing rods and all of that. Meanwhile, Steve Reese shows up in the 1920s as a mining engineer, and he goes to work with the Hoover family, as in Herbert Hoover, the president of the United States, and his sons. All of that is documented in an interview at MIT. And it was Christopher Bird at that interview with Morad and Christopher's brother. And so maybe it was Chris's brother. It was that fourth person up there. I don't know. But anyway, so they were contemporaries. And that's why the two books are so great. One is scientific, if you read it, and most people get lost after the third or fourth chapter. And then there's the dowsing side. And the two were both remarkable men, locating hundreds, together thousands of wells documented. But Vern, he did have his own primary water theory, which he believed it was mostly coming from steam. And Steve also more or less had the same concepts. It's earth generated. And so they were contemporaries. To some extent, I've heard they kind of worked together, especially when Emmett Culligan, as in the Culligan man, Culligan water softeners to this day, got involved, and he founded the, along with some other businessmen, the resources, what's the name of that? The one that published the book, and out of Los Angeles. And he was funding Vern Cameron to go out and look for wells in Southern California. He was funding Steve Reese to go prove this and get in front of the Senate. He wrote presidents. He wrote the Pope. Emmett Culligan did. So the two were contemporaries, somewhat competitors, if you will, but also cooperating in the primary water paradigm, trying to make it accepted.
And that's what interested me. I thought, dowsing has been around forever. And here's a guy that's trying to figure out the science of it. I'm like, wow.
Did you ever see Steve Reese douse?
No, not with a stick. He had the heavy metal cylinder. So he would look at the geology of the hillside, then he'd look at the minerals, and then he would use that cylinder that went down, measured something in how depth something was down there in the depths that he would measure, and that's where he would come up with, and he would be able to figure out how deep that well would have to be to come up with water. So, that thing, yeah. Well,
that thing is the Algar explorer of none other than Dr. Armin Bickel, who's an incredibly important part of this story, right? Who is a fellow German, comes over after World War II in the Operation Paperclip, ends up at Vandenberg Air Force Base, which is Lompoc, California, not far away from Ohio and all of that. And they meet and they start working together. And you saw Reese using this when? 70s and early 80s?
Late 70s. We would, like I said, we would look at the geology, then we'd look at the minerals that are there, and then we would walk back and forth until he determined this is the spot. And then he would tell you, hey, we're going to go down this 100 feet or 150 feet. He would tell me that he could find a hot water or cold water.
How could he tell the depth? Any idea?
I don't know how he did that. No.
Yeah,
but he would estimate
right?
that also.
But he could also believe hot or cold. He could predict like thermal versus.
He told me that he could find hot or cold. He told me back then that they would find water on the moon.
Amazing. I love it. I love it. So that's an incredibly important part of the story that a lot of people didn't know about. Because we're going to interview someone who came after you right around 83 to 85. He was similarly a young guy there in California, joined, into what was going on. But he says, I don't remember technology being used. Well, that's gamma ray scintillation counter. That is technology. But maybe by then he'd lost it or wasn't using it because he was so good, as you know, at visually, right? Looking at the earth and the minerals and the indications, right?
Oh, we'd be driving and he'd point out a hill and he goes, how come there's trees growing on that hill? There's no water table up there.
This is interesting because when I talk with Davina, Vern Cameron used the dowsing method. And so Stephen Reese obviously didn't. So they're two kind of polar opposites ways of finding primary water. So this is interesting that we're going into this other way. So his was more just all focused more on using tools. No, that's not the right word. Using science, I guess, because Vern Cameron.
He was a scientist. He would talk geology, mineralogy, tectonics, geochemistry, which he was trained in, geochemistry, crystallography. Right, having worked in mines, worked around minerals, and figuring out how assaying, like how much gold would be in something, and was it worthwhile to continue, drilling and dredging and so forth. He was an absolutely traditionally European trained in science, man of science. Vern is 100% guy, looks at his grandma and goes, that's incredible. And for the rest of his life, tries to figure out the science of dowsing. Just because it's analog and not digital doesn't mean it's not real. Most wells to this day are located by dowsers. You can't get away from it.
So, Mark, when you were at my property, I think you use both. Do you use both nowadays?
Absolutely. We have no issue with dowsing. In fact, we love to get a property that's already been doused because then we can go, and sometimes they make it easier. They will almost always find the geopathic, the zones, the fracture zones or faults. The big question then is, are they in the right side or wrong side of the fault? Or are they over the heart of the structure or maybe off by this much? Right. But our focus as primary water technologies, of course, is to bring these two technologies, one of which goes back decades in primary water search. Okay. It's a lot more modernized now. Instead of wearing a battery around your neck back then to operate it, we've got four double A's inside of a handheld computer. Made in Germany, by the way, where Bickel was from. And then a passive seismic system that can see down hundreds, if not thousands of feet. Steve Reese and all those guys would have just been beside themselves to finally have something as simple as we deploy to see and create cross sections so deeply of what they were thinking about, whether dowsing or scientifically, was down there. And yes, there were technologies, they're very expensive. They were mostly used in the oil and gas industry. To this day, a water well, how much can you spend to locate your well unless you're really, well, a municipal, industrial, commercial entity? The rest of us, most of the time, it's hire your local dowser for a few $100.
Right.
So we use both. Ryan, who's one of my operators based out of Las Vegas, he also has learned really well how to douse, and also, by the way, map douse. So he'll look at it in advance, and quite often the area of the property that it speaks to him, his pendulum, is of interest to us. It doesn't tell you within a meter. Remember, a borehole's this big, like 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 inches across. So even a map, you can't know, you could be way off if you picked a latitude and longitude point, right? Until getting there and then surveying it. But he's very good. He's learned it very well. And there are other people who can it's called remote
viewing.
Healing is personal bio, but remote viewing. And they'll go through various similar things. And then some of them are so good they believe they can see down the borehole, and people have checked it out and said, oh my gosh. And those powers, they exist. But for most of us, we're like, I just bought my 40 acres. I want a well. Can somebody help me locate it for a reasonable price?
Yeah.
How much does Steve Reese charge, by the way? Any idea, Larry?
I thought it was $6,000, but that's just a number from a long time ago.
A typical, back then, but of course, typically they were, he wanted them to go deep and big and get a lot of water. So, and that was, 50 years ago.
That was a lot of money, yeah.
It wasn't cheap.
He drove 2 Mercedes. He had some money.
He had a track record that was amazing. I mean, just ridiculous. And massive wells. You could just talk to anyone.
So that was to survey and to drill the well?
No, that was just a survey to find it. Then the driller had to come in.
Wow, that's quite a bit.
But
that's not what it is today.
Well, as we're growing, we can command more, right? But we're up to about 4,000 for a typical homestead project. We'll discount. Do we have more projects on the same trip, et cetera, right? Okay. We get up over 10,000 if it's a 3-day and it's a lot of acres and we're on a big ranch or farm and so forth. But we
that
only
was in the 60s and 70s. So
that I know, but he had a track record.
That's the number that sticks in my head, but I wouldn't bet my life on it.
No, I've seen it. I know. I have the same number in writing up in there. Absolutely. And man, these were wealthy customers most of the time. They needed a well.
They had big ranches with no water.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. We're charging upwards of 10 to 12 now for a bigger ranch, but we're there 2, 3 days, 4 days. Okay. Yeah. So, but we haven't been in it that long, but as our track record increased, trust me, we get more and more people who say, okay, I want one of those wells. And he had decades where he could point and go talk to that customer. They were documented, of course, in the 50s because of the big fight over the Feather River. Thousands of gallons a minute.
Yeah. It's like Sparklet's water. And there's another place on the backside of the Sierras that is a big, I think it's just another water bottle company that was done with that type of water. But that was finding aquifers.
Interesting. California or Nevada?
California, the east side of the Sierras.
Okay.
There's a lot of aquifers there, but he would just have an eye for that stuff.
Yeah. So that device that you just showed, Mark, that is the original from back when, or is that? I'll
send you a photo. It'll be great to drop over this. Yeah. And I'm showing it in my email to the Friends of Primary Water. I'm standing there with the old one, including the machine with all the dials, and then Ryan is on my side. He has the new one. It's a pretty blue aluminum and a handheld computer. So yeah, it's you'll have a nice picture of that to put into this.
Okay,
How'd you come
perfect.
about getting that old one?
I was coming back from the States earlier this year. Ryan was hitting the internet hard again on finding some of the old sites about Bickle and a few new things. He found someone selling one up in Canada, but it was like in pieces. And then he spotted this on eBay. And I mean, in almost perfect condition. I bought it sight unseen, and it came with the manual. I know that manual has existed. I would have paid $700 for the manual alone. And so I got it. And in Germany, my partner says, "Oh yeah, I can get that working."
Wow.
Christmas came early. Oh man.
Yeah. So around the world right now, Mark, give me an idea of how many teams or I don't know if you call them teams, but how many companies or teams I'd say are doing this actively right now? You had given me a bunch of websites, and I'm not sure how many are actually groups that are working together.
As Larry can say, I mean, the number of people who use the term primary water, fight the fight, the good fight, and go out and do it is a small number. In fact, Larry, let me first ask you, did you hear, like back then, were there other primary water people that he had set up anywhere?
Yeah, two people, Paul and his neighbor, Vern, I think it was. That was it.
That was it.
I thought,
right?
what an amazing thing that you can do, and somebody's got to grab the ball and run with it. And thankfully, I found you.
No, it's been great because you have that neat period of time of 70s and 80s where he's been through his battles. He's a settled guy. He didn't live, like you say, extravagantly. He got $1 million for selling that property in Simi Valley in 1953. He was set for life, right?
Yeah.
And he invested a lot in his own money doing these projects. But he ultimately retired in Escondido, and that's where that video is made by Wayne Weber in 1985. Finally, we see him and hear him, although there are a few older tapes and interviews of him that we were getting a hold of. And there he was talking about a lifetime of locating and battling, right? These things. And there you are in the 70s where he has now been, who's come into his orbit is Morad Iqbal, whose father, by the way, was married into the Pahlavi family. His father was a former prime minister of Iran. His father was the longtime minister of minerals and oil in Iran. He was not just...
That's how we got the connection that we were going to go to Iran and study.
He sends Morad to Germany and to study mining and this and that. And he knew of the story of Reese in Israel and Egypt and Saudi Arabia back in the late 50s. It was in the papers. Who's this guy locating this water that helped Israel develop Eilat as a port back then? Okay. He goes ultimately to the States after he's got his degrees. Father sends him there and says, find this guy and bring him to Iran. So you joined the team by 77, and I think how long? About a year or two they'd been into preparing for that expedition. Is that right?
Oh yeah, we talked about it for at least 2 or 3 years, and then there was problems in Iran, and everything went south. And I go, now what? And he goes, well, you better find a job because I don't have anything for you right now.
But you weren't any of those planning meetings with maps of Iran or anything.
No.
Yeah.
No, he would just tell me about it, that he was working on it, and I trusted him that we were working on it. Mm-hmm.
Right.
So me and Morad, we were heading to Iran. It was all a done deal until then it never happened. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Interesting. Really interesting.
How many teams are today? That's really what I was trying to.
Okay. So back to me, I mean, I got into this right there, 2012, and another group was forming up in Ojai, headed by Ted Moore, a developer. On that team is Tim. I want to say Tim Scott. It's not Tim Hall, he kind of succeeded Larry in about 1983, 4 or 5 before Reese passed away, and got involved and was involved in some drilling and things. He's on that team and a few others. But they're pretty much Southern California focused, and they've gone after certain projects. So they are out there using the term primary water. there's Primary Water Technologies, me and my various operators that I'm setting up. I've got 3 active ones now with the equipment trained up here in the States. Ryan, now Zarin in Southern California, Micah, and a couple of more who want to get in, but I need to have, enough business to keep going and get them, afford getting them the equipment. And then I've got partners in, Australia over 3 years now. I mean, they're just blowing it out. And one of my partners there is Robert Gourlay. He is the Paul Power of Australia. He goes back primary water decades. And there, Steve Reese or Vern Cameron was a guy named Lance Endersby. And he's written a book that's really had to self-publish it, kind of like the book Larry showed us. It's crazy because it's also alt science or against the mainstream of hydrology and hydrogeology that nobody wants to touch it, sadly. And so Robert over there, and then those guys, my partners, and I get data in every week from them. Okay, and dozens and dozens and dozens of great case studies, hundreds of surveys done, Western Australia, et cetera. We're now actually looking at buying property and developing it and putting it in a portfolio, right? Instead of just doing this for a service. Partners in South Africa who are trying to be active in a very difficult environment where power is load shedding occurs 4 times a day, et cetera. Europe, we're doing really well now with a geophysicist in Italy doing the work, and my partner in France, who Marie Aishagi, and they've already had 4 projects in France, and they're getting more inquiries from around Europe. Our website's in French, Italian, now it's in German and Spanish now. And so there's a few more out there. I'm not coming to mind, but Nepal, my employee in Dubai, is based there. We have a good firm there. And Kenya, we have equipment there for East Africa, et cetera. So we're trying to get there. We're still small, but we can respond to a project anywhere.
Okay.
So besides you, there's not many people in the world that are doing this.
Not calling it primary water and fighting the fight. Other people dowsers do it, right? But I mean, they have the dowsing paradigm. So it's vein water, right? And that sort of thing. And you can't put a panel of dowsers in front of the state water authority and expect to get anywhere, right? Even though they know those guys are finding the wells, they're going to laugh it off. Bunch of old guys with willow sticks, right? Okay, we bring data to the table. And I'm now getting dragged in a bit to the vicious politics of the West and the Colorado River compact states. And as the water crisis is now reaching yet another crescendo, and I get calls and I've made a few presentations, but it's thankless work. We know what the system's broken. I'd much rather just go locate wells for homesteaders, for ranchers, farmers, and people who need it and appreciate it. There's plenty of that out there rather than going and, chucking spears at these idiotic politicians and worse, the bureaucrats.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's not going to be a lot of movement, I think, in those avenues, those spheres. And as mankind, men and women, if they learn how to stand up for use their own free will and stand up for what they need, there is nothing that can stand in the way. So I like that, going after the people that are just kind of, they know this, and, people that are just looking for water like myself,
Most people come, they hear about the primary water, they look us up, I'd say 80%, right, maybe more, are going, I want some of that. Can you help me? How do I locate it? Or how can I come to work for you?
Oh, cool. Yeah. Once you learn about primary water, and you're going to drill a well anyway, it's game over. When you learn about primary water, I was like, I don't want to, there's no way that I'm going to waste the money that I would spend on a well to drill for groundwater. There's just no way. And so even
we're like the insurance policy, at least, that you drill where the water is, and versus just, where would you like the water? Wait, drill where it is. We know our neighbor had a dry bore. We know that neighbor has crummy water. That one has amazing water. In the same, I can see all 3 wells. Well, what's going on here? I want that well. Well, let's come and deploy some geophysics and use some science, which is 180 degrees upside down from modern hydrology and modern hydrogeology. By the way, Larry, did you get in? You were studying what? Natural resources at
Natural resources. Yeah, I worked for the Fish and Game when I got out of college.
No,
but this was something that interests me. The other thing Stephen told me, he goes, you can prove that this water is not part of the hydraulic or the cycle from clouds and rain because of the chemistry of the water. I think it was called tritium that was produced after the atomic bomb, and there would be traces of that in your normal water, but in the primary water, chemically, it was clean as could be. So you could prove that it wasn't from the normal cycle of water that we all know.
Did he have a laboratory that you ever went into?
No, he did take me to a place where he was producing silver to silver 0.999 pure silver.
Wow.
But I just saw that one time, and it was up in the hills someplace.
Interesting. Yeah, he worked at some incredible mines. That's documented as well.
So for the audience, this is a real thing. This is not something that's woo-woo. Even though the first episode I talked with Davina Cox and we looked at a lot of the history of what she was aware of and how dowsing works, it still might seem a little woo-woo to people. But now we have a gentleman here who's using both techniques and has, I would say, updated or scientifically updated equipment. And this is very possible for anyone who wants to drill a well. Primary water is nothing like groundwater, and the people are doing this. So, Mark, you're in the field, and so people are doing this all over the United States, and it's legal, right? It's
We're providing a survey service at the end of the day. It's a survey, right?
Okay.
I mean, we don't drill. We advise a lot. We talk a lot about drilling techniques and try to help pre-qualify and identify drillers in the area. And when we do our map study in advance and well data study, we can usually spot, based on the bore logs that are filed, how they're working, what kind of rigs, do they go open bore in hard rock, and what size they use and all of that. And we can usually come up with one or two names for them to contact and go get the quotes to have the wells drilled.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is what you're doing the survey, you're doing the first part. And so when I talked with my local drilling company for where my property is, they didn't even know what primary water was. And then I got worried and I talked to Ryan and I was like, how do I navigate this? And he's like, you just go for it. And they, just get
they may
well
be interested
anyway.
in the geophysics because they see that and may go, okay, that's interesting. What does it mean? And some of them want to partner with us or send us referrals because we pay 10% referral fees, and others are really want to be arm's length. And honestly, a lot of geophysics has promised the moon and hasn't succeeded, so they're cautious. And by nature, remember, by business model, they get paid whether it's dry or not, so they need to be very careful, right? Getting in the middle of that. And if it's a dry bore, you're still paying thousands of dollars, okay? But Larry, let me ask you: did you ever, come across Jim Scott, who was Steve Reese's driller? Maybe he passed away by then, but he had that guy drilled many of his wells.
No, we would locate the wells, then somebody else would drill it, and then we'd stop by later and when it was over and check the water and see that it happened.
Sounded like he needed Jim Scott on a number of those wells based on the cave-ins and the problems they were having. He went all the way to Israel for him and all over. He was in a really, he drilled the wells in California that were really important. The Simi Valley, the ones out in
Sparklets water.
Yeah, I think the Sparklets one. He was really extraordinary driller. But at some point, you just have to rely on the drillers that are out there. But it's a very hard business to stay in these days. It's mom and pop typically, and all the regulations are becoming harder and harder, diesel and certifying this and just all of us just trying to get wells as they narrow down where you can drill and put basins on. They're not making it, Terry, any easier.
Okay, that was what I was kind of going for. What is the present climate of that? So regulations, it looks like they're getting it's getting harder. Yeah,
especially again, Colorado River Compact states where the monopoly system is the Bureau of Reclamation at the top, the largest wholesaler of water in America, maybe the world. Then the canal systems, federal and state, and then of course your local municipal water company, the largest of which is the Met, the Metropolitan Water Authority of Los Angeles. The biggest, largest, sharpest elbows in the system. And you're dealing with all of those, including here in Phoenix or up there in Phoenix. You can't just say, your water's crummy, I want the Verizon of water. I want to call the T-Mobile of water. you have one water company, don't you? And they love it. And then they're all strangled by this river, and rates are going up in double digits right now in Phoenix. And
Yeah.
so, yet they do have some wells in their inventory. I spoke up there in Northeast Phoenix, and I said, just perfect segue. The lady making the slide presentation said, oh, we have the most wells in Phoenix. The next slide says 3% of their water comes from wells. Well, how about working on the 3% if the Colorado River can't give you as much water anymore? Oh, you're stepping into some big battles right there. Big water politics.
Yeah.
And Stephen had those battles too. That's why he just stuck with farmers and yeah.
Right? You heard that when you were with him those 5-6 years. You heard the same politics back then.
Yeah, he worked with farmers and developers, and the hell with politics.
The way forward is grassroots. And in every sector that I've seen, when I'm talking to people, when I'm considering how we're going to get out of this control structure system, it's grassroots and educating the people that just want the stuff done, just want what they need to live.
Right.
And these control structures that are up there, the powers that shouldn't be, let's say, that's not where we're going to get the movement. So
I talk about water security, which all of the above. I'm all the above guy. I'm not against the next great big scheme, but get groundwater modernized and a proper seat at the table, and water independence for as many people as it can get it. Right. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, Larry, did you ever run into the second generation, I call it, of primary water, which would have been Paul Power and Bill Cox? Did you know or meet either of them?
No, I didn't. Through my research, I've heard about Paul up in Oregon, but I never met him. Mm-hmm.
I think by then he was pretty much on his own. They were trying to co-opt him onto that Iranian expedition, and he talks about it. But as you said, same thing. It didn't happen, so he didn't get anything out of it. Yeah. And then it moved. The Reese Institute was created and moved to the East Coast. So
yeah, at that point, Steve was a one-man show, and he'd travel around through California at that point.
Yeah, the Bill Cox, the name never came up.
I don't remember that name now,
because by then he was Vern Cameron's #1 disciple, but kind of again going on his own and taking primary water to Japan in the 70s. In fact, 70s, 80s.
Yeah, he was all over. He was all over too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mark, is there anything else that you wanted to ask Larry? Anything else you wanted to discuss?
No, I mean, it's just such an important period, the 70s, early 80s there. The fact that Steve Reese, we know, worked with Armin Bickel, and in fact, he was deploying his gamma-ray scintillation counter to assist in his amazing 3D brain and science, primary water science that he conducted and lived in the field as a mining engineer and geochemist. And there's no reason we can't be continuing to use geophysics. It's an extractive industry. All the others use it to a extraordinary extent before they put a spade in the ground. So let's bring it to water wells. And we're doing stuff in Africa now for on the charity side in Madagascar and Kenya. I was on the phone today. Besides just helping out our own homesteaders and people who want to have water independence. So I mean, Larry, it was great. Thank you for reaching out to me and giving us a really great, part of this story of Steve Reese toward the end of his career and the end of his life.
Yeah, it sounds like we're in that third generation now. And Larry, what we're trying to do on the Water Series podcast is to extract the stories of the early years, which I understand is kind of the 60s right now, even though there might have been some before that we're not aware of. But, so like Stephen Reese is deceased and Bill Cox is deceased. Paul Powers is now deceased. So those who had contact with those gentlemen, we want to get the stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, and that's why you interested us also, is because you had met Stephen Reese. And I have a question for you, and that's, what does your near future look like with primary water? You had contacted Mark and got a hold of him. Is there an interest there that you have now recently that you think you're going to get more involved?
You know what? It was just a passion that I always was interested in. And I wanted to make sure that somebody in the world took on that passion, and I'm glad Mark did it. So I just want to hang out and keep in touch with him all the time now and see what's going on. And if I can help, I'm here to help.
Excellent. Well, I think you are today on the podcast just by, we're getting the word out and we're telling stories, and those that knew, maybe Stephen, could benefit, those that knew Bill Cox, those that are customers perhaps of Mark. So we're trying to get the word out with the water series, and I hope you'll stay in touch with all of us. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for doing this podcast and helping get the word out.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I appreciate your time, both of you. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Thanks,
Great.
guys. Mm-hmm.